Title of the lesson, as you can see, is Runt, and it is taken from 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7. God does not see the same way people see. People look at the outside of a person, but the Lord looks at the heart. 6th grade. Do any of you really remember 6th grade? Okay, some of you do, some of you don't. Largely, I do not remember a whole lot about 6th grade. I don't remember what grades I got when I was in 6th grade. I can't even tell you the name of that little blonde-haired girl that I had a crush on. But the spring, that spring evening of 1969, I remember that like it was yesterday. Because I'm seated in the den because I had asked my parents if I could leave the dinner table. Mom had even made some cookies, but I had passed on the opportunity to have my mother's hot out of the oven, homemade chocolate chip cookies because I wasn't feeling very sociable that night. I mean, who has the time for sweets in my head at a time as important as this? Frankly, I had hoped that the call was going to come before dinner, but unfortunately it hadn't come. And I had even listened for the phone to ring during dinner, and it hadn't rung. So now I'm staring at the phone like my dog True stares at his dog dish, hoping, just hoping, that a Little League coach is going to tell me that I've made the All-Star team. So I'm sitting on my couch with my glove by my side, and I can hear my buddies outside playing in the street, but that is of absolutely no interest to me because I don't care. All that matters is the phone, and I want it to ring. Please ring. And it doesn't. I help with the dishes. I finish my homework in silence. By the way, when I was growing up, this is the kind of phone that we used. We didn't have it attached to the wall. It was a rotary dial. And in fact, instead of it being like my home phone number was 867, but it wasn't 86, it was Topaz 7. Do you remember those days? Do you remember party lines? Do you remember trying to get on the phone and other people are talking and you're waiting for them to be done with their conversation so that you can have one? That's how old school I am, but that is the phone. And so I helped my mother finish the dishes and I'm doing my homework, but it's in utter silence. Mom says some really kind words to me like she always did, but I don't really respond. Bedtime is now just around the corner, but the phone never rings. It just sits there in silence in the den. And for me, it was really painful silence. Because now, in the great scheme of things, not making an all-star team probably doesn't matter a lot. To a 60-year-old, it certainly doesn't. But to an 11-year-old, they don't always see things in the grand scheme of things. Because it was a huge deal for me. And all I could think about was what I would say when schoolmates asked me if I had been selected. Didn't have an answer for them. It was depressing. I felt I had been rejected. For me, in my 11-year-old mind, it was a disaster. And I'm thinking maybe you've known those feelings before. Perhaps the phone may not have rung for you either. Well, at least maybe in the grander scheme of things, maybe it didn't. Like when you applied for a job or when you tried to make up. The call just never came. And you know the pain of what it means to not hearing that phone ring, that no call. Because we've all had those experiences. In fact, we've even coined phrases for it. He was left holding the bag. Or she was left standing at the altar. Or they were left out in the cold. Or he's out taking care of the sheep. And that's the expression that I want to explain to you this morning. Because that expression is used about a character in the Bible whose name is David. We've talked about David a great deal in this church. And David's story begins on a hillside of Israel as an equally ancient priest is trundling down this narrow trail with a heifer lumbering behind him. Bethlehem lies ahead, and anxiety for this priest is brewing within. And the farmers that are out in the field notice. This is a very unusual set of circumstances. They notice him, and those who know his face start whispering his name. And those who hear the name turn to stare at the face of the prophet. Samuel. Samuel. It was Samuel the prophet. God's chosen priest is now right there in Bethlehem, of all places. He had been called by God as a young child. And when the sons of Eli had turned sour, young Samuel then stepped forward to be the prophet of God. When Israel needed spiritual focus, Samuel provided it. And when Israel wanted a king, Samuel was the one who anointed the first king, and that was Saul. And now the very name of Saul causes Samuel to just groan. Oh, Saul. The Israelites wanted a king. So we have a king, all right. They wanted a leader, and we have a maniac or manic instead. Saul's heart as the king has grown harder and harder, and his eyes have become wilder and wilder. He isn't the king that he used to be. In fact, in God's eyes, he isn't the king anymore. The Lord had already told Samuel, how long are you going to feel sorry for Saul? I've rejected him as king of Israel. So fill your container with olive oil and go. I'm sending you to Jesse, who lives in Bethlehem, because I have chosen one of his sons to be king. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1. And so Samuel is now trundling into Bethlehem. And his stomach is probably just churning, and his thoughts are racing. Because frankly, if you're Samuel, it's a little hazardous to be crowning another king when you already have one, especially a crazed person like Saul. But it's even more hazardous to live with no leader at all in such explosive times. 1000 BC, which is approximately the time when this whole story takes place, was really a bad time for this ramshackle bunch of Israelites. Although Joshua and Moses were just legendary heroes, 3 centuries, 300 years of spiritual wilderness had frozen the people's faith. One writer described the days between Joshua and Samuel with this very terse sentence. It's taken from Judges chapter 21, verse 25. In those days, Israel did not have a king. Everyone did what seemed right. Corruption had fueled disruption, and immorality had given birth to absolute brutality. The people had demanded a king, but rather than saving the ship, Saul had almost sunk the ship of Israel. Israel's first monarch turned out to be a psychotic blunderer. And then there were the Philistines. These are a warring, bloodthirsty, giant-breeding people who had cornered the market on iron and blacksmithing. The Philistines built cities while the Jewish people hung out in tents. Philistines forged iron weapons while the Hebrews fought with crude slings and arrows. Philistines thundered in flashing chariots while the Israelites retaliated with farm tools. In fact, in one battle, the entire Hebrew army had only 2 swords. The whole army. And one belonged to Saul, and the other belonged to his son, Jonathan. So there was corruption from within. There is danger from without. Saul is weak, and the nation was even weaker. So what does God do? Well, he did what no one would have ever imagined he would do. He issued a surprise invitation to a nobody from nowhere. It's like he dispatched Samuel to Ramona, California. Now, I live in Ramona. Randall lives in Ramona. Eleonora lives in Ramona. No dispersions on Ramona. That's where I choose to live. But Bethlehem at the time was a little bit like Ramona. It's a sleepy little village that time in that context had forgotten. It's kind of nestled in the foothills, and it's some 6 miles south of Jerusalem. Bethlehem sat 2,000 feet above the Mediterranean Sea, and it looked down on these gentle green hills that flatten out into this really gaunt, rugged pasture land. And Jesus, as we know, would issue his first cry under the Bethlehem sky. But 1,000 years before then, 1,000 years before the manger scene that we all remember at Christmas, Samuel enters the village pulling a cow. And his arrival has now turned heads of the residents because prophets simply never, ever came to Bethlehem. So they're thinking, has he come to preach to someone? Or maybe he's coming to hide somewhere? I mean, Samuel would certainly have a reason to hide. Neither. Because the stoop-shouldered priest assures them of that fact. And he has come, as he says, to sacrifice this particular animal to God and invites the elders of Bethlehem and Jesse and his sons to join him. Now, the scene as we read comes across as a bit of a beauty pageant almost. Samuel examines these 7 boys one at a time. It's like a Miss America contest. And Samuel's about to anoint the first one that he sees or the second one that he sees. And constantly God says no. God stops him each and every time. For instance, Eliab, he was the oldest of Jesse's sons. He would seem to be the logical choice. I mean, envision him maybe as the village Casanova there in Bethlehem. Wavy-haired, strong-jawed. He wears tight jeans and has this piano keyboard kind of smile. This is the guy, Samuel thinks. Wrong, God says. Okay, well then, son number 2, Abinadab. He enters as contestant number 2. And you'd think this guy is like a GQ model, and he had just walked in. Italian suit, alligator skin shoes, jet black oiled back hair, Rolex watch. If you want a classy king, Abinadab would be the one for you. Nope, God says. God's not into classy. So Samuel asks for brother number 3. His name is Shammah. Now, Shammah is kind of bookish looking. You know, the really studious, serious type. He's bursting with brains, but could probably use a bit of a charisma transplant. He's got a degree from Harvard, and his eyes are set on postgraduate studies. And Jesse is whispering to Samuel, he graduated valedictorian, Bethlehem High School. Samuel is impressed, but God isn't. He reminds the priest in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, God doesn't see the same way people see. People look at the outside of a person, but the Lord looks at the heart. So 7 sons pass. 7 sons fail the inspection. And the procession then comes to a halt. And Samuel is counting the siblings. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Hey, Jesse, don't you have 8 sons? A similar question, as you recall, caused Cinderella's stepmother to become very uncomfortable with that kind of question, and Jesse is likely doing the same. Jesse says, yeah, I still have the youngest son. He's out taking care of the sheep. Now, the Hebrew word used for youngest son implies more than just age. It also suggests rank. So the youngest son was more than the youngest brother. He was the little brother, or to put it differently, he was the runt. And sheep watching fits runts. Put the boy where he can't cause any trouble. Leave him out there with the woolly heads in the open skies. And that's where we find David, in the pasture with a flock of sheep. Now, church, the Bible dedicates 66 chapters of the Bible to his story, more than anyone else except for Jesus Christ. The New Testament mentions David's name 59 times. He will establish and rule the world's most famous city, Jerusalem. He's the greatest psalmist we've ever known. Hundreds of psalms flow from his pen. We'll call him a king, or we can call him a minstrel, or we can call him even a giant killer. But today, he's not even included in the family meeting. He's just a forgotten kid performing some menial task in a nowhere town. So what caused God to pick him? After all, we've all walked in David's pastures before, haven't we? You know, the pasture of exclusion, because we're weary of society's surface level system of being graded according to the inches of our waist, or the square footage of our home, or the color of our skin, or the label of our clothes. Don't you get tired of that? Hard work is ignored and devotion is left completely unrewarded. The boss chooses cleavage over character, and the teacher picks the pet students instead of the prepared ones. And parents show off their favorite sons and leave their runts out in the field. Are you tired of that enemy of exclusion? Then it's time to quit staring at him. Who cares what they think? What matters is what your Maker thinks. The Lord does not see a man as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Those words were written for runts like us. Written for the misfits and the outcasts, because God uses them all. Let me give you some examples. Moses ran from justice, but God used him. Jonah ran away from God, and God used him. Rahab, she ran a brothel. Samson ran to the wrong woman. Sarah ran out of hope. And Lot ran with the wrong crowd. But God used all of them. And David, God saw a teenager serving him in a backward town, and through the voice of a brother, God said, "David, come inside. Someone wants to see you." You see, human eyes saw this gangly teenager enter the house, smelling like sheep and needing definitely a bath. Yet the Lord said in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 12, the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is the one." God had rejected all 7 before David. They were clearly much better from a societal standpoint than choosing David. You had the smart one, you had the good-looking one, you had the tan one, you had the buff one, you had the smart one. You had it all. And yet God said, no, 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 I want that one, the runt. God saw what no one else saw. A God seeking heart. David, for all of his flaws, and we know that he had many, sought after God like white on rice. He took after God's heart because he stayed after God's heart. And in the end, that's all God wanted and needed. And today, that's all God wants or needs from you and me. You see, others might measure your waist size or your wallet, not God. He examines hearts. And when he finds one that is set on him, he calls it and he claims it. The story of this young David assures us of one thing. Our Father knows our hearts. And because he does, he has a place reserved just for us. God doesn't care about your waist size. God doesn't care about the square footage of your house. God doesn't care about the color of your skin or the label of your clothes. God knows and cares about your heart. So, church, unlike me, an 11-year-old asking that phone to ring, your phone is ringing. And I would encourage you to pick it up because God's got some great news for you. You're an all-star. God sees your heart, wants you on his team, wants you to get in the game, wants you to be his servant, wants you to live the life that he created you to live. In our bulletin, there's an insert. Most of you are aware of that. If there are prayer requests that you'd like this church to be mindful of in prayer, you can hand those up here in just a moment. And after the close of the song, we'll talk about that. We'll pray over them. We'll pray for our meal. And then we'll enjoy lunch together. We've picked out a song. We praise thee, O God. I want you, if you would please, to sing that with conviction. Because God loves each and every one of you and knows your heart. He doesn't care about your wallet or waist size or color or anything. He cares about this. And once he knows that he has this, he can use it to work miracles. Let's stand and let's sing.